Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled BP Statistical Review of World Energy 2021, the Year of COVID. We're grateful to our presenter, Dr. Richard de Caux, for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our speaker. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our speaker, please use Zoom's Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom window to type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Richard de Caux, Head of Industry and Buildings in BP's Economics and Energy Insight team. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for this kind introduction. I should say that I'm not a doctor. I wish I was, and there are many doctors in my team, but I'm just a Mr. de Caux. So yeah, great to be here. I'm really ashamed that we can't be together in person. We hope next year will be different, but for now, the great thing is, of course, doing a virtual presentation. It means that we can get so many people from so many places around the world together. So there are some upsides for that. So I should share my screen. Let's do that, and we'll get started. Okay, hoping you can all see the title slide of my presentation now. Yeah, this is an amazing year to be reviewing this year, with so much that happened last year. It's also the 70th anniversary of the Statistical Review, so we're incredibly proud of that. Since it was first published in 1952, the Statistical Review has provided a constant source of objective, comprehensive, and trusted data to help industry, governments, and commentators make sense of developments in global energy markets. Before I get into it, I just want to thank all of the team, both at BP, but also Heriot-Watt University, our long-term partners on the Stats Review, for their tremendous hard work and dedication in compiling the data for this year's review. Producing the review is never the easiest of tasks, but I think it's fair to say that doing so while we were all working remotely has made it even more challenging. Over the 70 years that the Stats Review has been going, it has borne witness to some of the most dramatic episodes in the history of the global energy system. The Suez Canal crisis in 1956, the oil embargo of 1973, soon followed by the Iranian Revolution in 1979. More recently, the Fukushima disaster in 2011. These were all significant shocks to the energy market, but all pale in comparison to the events of last year. But most importantly, of course, the pandemic that erupted last year was a humanitarian tragedy. As of last week, around 4 million people were reported to have died as a result of COVID-19. The true number is likely to be far higher, and it continues to rise. The pandemic also led to a huge economic loss. Global GDP is estimated to have fallen by over 3.5% last year, the largest peacetime recession since the Great Depression. The IMF estimates that around 100 million people have been pushed into poverty as a result of the virus. And the economic scarring from the pandemic, especially for the world's poorest and least developed economies, is expected to persist for many years after the virus is brought under control. Long COVID can take many forms. For the global energy system, the combination of the pandemic, together with efforts to limit its spread, led to an impact unmatched in modern peacetime. For energy, 2020 was a year like no other. The aim for today is to use the new Stats Review data to shed light on those developments. I plan to focus the discussion around 3 questions. First, over the past year, we've been bombarded with daily headlines of unprecedented developments and volatility. Standing back from the noise, what exactly happened last year in the world of energy, and how surprising was it? Second, the global pandemic was the ultimate stress test. Both engineers and economists will tell you that we can learn a lot from how systems behave under extreme pressure. In that spirit, what have we learned from the response of the global energy system to the COVID-19 crisis? And finally, this all took place against a backdrop of increasing societal and political demands for an accelerated transition to a net zero energy system. Indeed, Glasgow in Scotland was due to host COP26 last year, arguably the most important UN climate conference since Paris. In the event, the conference had to be delayed until November of this year. So as we prepare for Glasgow, what lesson can we draw from the past year, and more generally for the developments since Paris, for the challenges and opportunities for this year's COP? Starting first with what actually happened last year, and how surprising was it? The headline numbers are dramatic. World energy demand is estimated to have fallen by 4.5%. and global emissions from energy use by 6.3%. These are huge falls by historic standards. You can see from the charts here, the largest fall in both energy demand and carbon emissions since World War II. Indeed, the fall of over 2 gigatons of CO2 in 1 year meant that carbon emissions last year were back to levels last seen in 2011. It's also striking that the carbon intensity of the energy mix, so the average carbon emitted per unit of energy used, fell by 1.8%, also one of the largest ever falls in post-war history. What should we think about these reductions? From a historic perspective, the falls in energy demand and carbon emissions are obviously dramatic. But from a forward-looking perspective, the rate of declining carbon emissions observed last year is similar to what the world needs to average each year for the next 30 years to be on track to meet the Paris climate goals. Put more precisely, if carbon emissions declined at the same average rate as last year for the next 30 years, then global emissions would decline by around 85% by 2050. For those of you familiar with BP's latest energy outlook, that is roughly midway between the rapid and net zero scenarios, which are broadly consistent with maintaining global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees centigrade and below 1.5 degrees C, respectively. Last year's fall in carbon emissions was obviously driven by the huge loss in economic output and activity. A simple calculation comparing the fall in emissions with a decline in world output equates to an implied carbon price of almost $1,400 per tonne, scarily high. The challenge is to reduce emissions without causing massive disruptions and damage to everyday lives and livelihoods. It's interesting to ask how surprising the fall in energy demands and carbon emissions were last year. Yes, they were the biggest falls since in 75 years, but they occurred against the backdrop of a global pandemic and the largest economic recession in post-war history. So how surprising were they, given everything that was going on? Well, the yellow line here shown in this chart is based on the same simple framework which we used in the 2019 Statistical Review to analyze movements in energy demand. The framework uses GDP growth, changes in oil prices as a proxy for energy prices, and the number of unusually hot and cold days. And that's done at a country level, predict the growth of energy demand by country, which is then aggregated up to get these global figures that you see here. The nice thing about this framework is that despite it being so simple, it can explain most of the broad movements in energy demand over the past 20 years or so. And the key feature of last year's fall in energy demand is that it was surprisingly big. Even after controlling for the collapse in economic activity, the decline in energy demand was close to twice the size of the predicted fall, 4.5%, compared with a predicted fall of around 2.5%. The source of this surprise can be better understood by looking at the size of the falls and the different components of energy demand. Oil demand is estimated to have fallen by an unprecedented 9.3%. That's 9.1 million barrels per day in 2020. Far larger than anything seen in history and much bigger than the falls in the other demand components. In fact, the fall in oil demand accounts for around 3/4 of the total decline in energy consumption. It is also the key factor accounting for the near record fall in the carbon intensity of the energy mix. The yellow bars in this chart use a similar modeling approach to derive predicted movements for each of the demand components. As you can see, the fall in oil consumption in 2020 was far bigger than expected based on past relationships. And the extent of that discrepancy was far greater than for any of the other demand components. The decline in natural gas was pretty much in line with the model prediction, and you can see electricity consumption actually fell by less than predicted. Of course, for all of us who experienced extended lockdowns last year, this is hardly surprising. The lockdowns detracted from oil demand in a completely different way to a normal economic downturn, crushing transport-related demand. Mobility metrics fell across the board. Use of jet fuel and kerosene is estimated to have plunged by 40%. You can see here how far it goes down relative to the others, as aviation across much of the world was grounded. Similarly, gasoline demand fell by around 13%, as road mobility measures crashed. In contrast, products most closely related to the petrochemical sector, so naphtha, ethane, and LPG, were broadly flat, supported in part by increasing demand for personal protective equipment, PPE, and other medical and hygiene-related supplies. In comparison, natural gas showed far greater resilience. Gas demand is estimated to have fallen by 2.3%, that's 81 billion cubic meters. Broadly similar decline to that seen in 2009 in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Consumption fell in most regions with the notable exception of China, where gas demand grew by almost 7%. The relative immunity of natural gas was helped by sharp falls in gas prices, which allowed gas generation to gain share in the US power market and hold its own in the EU. Electricity consumption is estimated to have experienced the smallest fall across the main components of final energy demand, falling by just 0.9% in 2020. The relative resilience of electricity usage was aided by the nature of the lockdowns, with falling power demand in industry and commercial buildings partially offset by increased domestic use by home-based workers and lockdown families. The relative resilience of overall power generation disguises a more significant shift in the generation mix. In particular, despite the fall in overall power generation, generation from renewables, excluding hydroelectricity, recorded its largest ever increase, 358 terawatt hours. This growth was driven by strong increases in both wind and solar generation. Encouragingly, the share of renewables in global generation recorded its fastest ever increase. So that continues the strong growth seen in recent years. Over the past 5 years, renewable generation has accounted for around 60% of the growth in global power generation, with wind and solar power more than doubling. The growth in renewables last year came largely at the expense of coal-fired generation, which experienced one of its largest declines on record, falling by 4.5% roughly. In addition to falling power demand and increasing deployment of renewables, coal was also hurt by loss of competitiveness relative to natural gas, especially in the US and the EU. These trends are exactly what the world needs to see as it transitions to net zero. Strong growth in renewables, crowding out coal. That said, the more than doubling in wind and solar generation over the past 5 years hasn't actually made the smallest dent in coal generation in level terms. The level of coal generation in 2020 was essentially unchanged from its level in 2015, as last year's falls simply offset increases from the previous years. It will take more than just strong growth in renewable energy to remove coal from the global power sector, especially at the pace it needs to happen. As highlighted by this chart on the right-hand side, you can see there is still a long way to go to squeeze coal out of the power sector. In the developed world, there needs to be greater progress on energy efficiency. And as we highlighted in the 2020 Energy Outlook, for many emerging markets to make significant inroads into the role of coal while still ensuring improved energy access, they will likely need to see an expansion in natural gas alongside renewable energy over the next 15 or 20 years. I'm just going to see if I can move this a bit so that you can see the charts a bit better. Okay. So finally, in terms of this section on how surprising was last year's fall in carbon emissions, what message should we take from this fall for future trends? Is this the beginning of the much hopeful downward trend in emissions or just a temporary COVID-induced dip? The two elements combining to produce the near record decline in carbon emissions, the fall in energy demand, shown here in purple, and the fall in the carbon intensity of the energy mix, shown in orange, can both largely be traced back to the unprecedented decline in oil demand triggered by the lockdowns. This suggests that as lockdowns around the world are eased and economic activity begins to recover, there is a significant risk that last year's fall in carbon emissions will be reversed. Indeed, the IEA recently estimated that the level of carbon emissions last December was already back above pre-crisis levels. Moving to the second question for today. What can we learn from the behavior of the energy system in response to the extreme stress test induced by the pandemic? The focus here is on the supply response. We're going to focus on the supply response. How did different parts of the energy industry react to the sudden unexpected fall in oil demand, in energy demand? As I've already mentioned, it's striking that the continual expansion of renewable energy was relatively unscathed by the pandemic. Impressive resilience. And I will be saying more about this later. For now, I'm going to concentrate on oil and natural gas markets, which were affected more severely by the events of last year. Moreover, oil and natural gas markets could become increasingly challenged as the energy transition gathers pace. So it's interesting to ask whether we can learn anything about their future behavior from their response to the stresses of last year. Starting first with oil. Over the year as a whole, global oil production is estimated to have fallen by 6.6 million barrels per day. Again, largest fall in post-war history. To get a sense of the timing and composition of that supply response, it's helpful to split the year into three phases. You can see phase one here already. Phase one covers the onset of the global pandemic from December 2019 to April 2020. This is a period in which oil consumption literally collapsed, demand reaching a trough in April of more than 20 million barrels per day below its pre-COVID levels. Off the charts relative to anything seen in history. The initial supply response to this was totally underwhelming. In fact, you may say it was counterproductive. The obvious source of that supply that could react quickly was OPEC. But as you may know, the key OPEC Plus meeting in early March 2020 ended in disagreement, with supply actually increasing from a period as a brief price war broke out. Oil inventories, you can see here in the center panel, accumulated at a record pace, and they increased by around 750 million barrels in 4 months. That scale of imbalance is unheard of and generated severe logistical issues in terms of both the availability of storage and the ability of excess supplies to access storage quick enough. Prices responded accordingly. If you look at the lower panel here, Brent reached a low of below $20 per barrel in April, and oil markets made front page news, you may remember, as US WTI prices briefly turned negative for the first time ever. The second phase, from April to August, saw a significant supply response. The main supply reaction came from OPEC+, who agreed to cut oil production by 9.7 million barrels per day between May and June, and this was later extended to July. US tight oil also responded, with production falling by around 2 million barrels per day between March and May. The responsiveness of tight oil is typically framed in terms of the rapid decline rates that in tight oil basins that they usually have, combined with the speed in which new investment can be halted. But the pace of response seen in the US last spring was far quicker than natural declines, and was largely driven by producing wells being shut in due to a combination of logistics and economics. The falls in US tight oil were joined by falls in conventional supplies. In total, North American production fell by around 4 million barrels per day between March and May, and that's roughly twice that of Russia. At the same time, demand partially recovered as lockdowns were eased initially in Asia and increasingly in the US and Europe. So this resulted in a broad convergence of production and consumption, and you can see inventories broadly stabilized in this period at their new elevated levels. The third and final phase, just move this again so you can see the label. The third and final phase from August through to the end of the year was one of gradual adjustment. Demand continued to edge up, although second waves of COVID spreading across different regions slowed the pace of recovery. Some of the supply response from both OPEC+ and US tight oil was partially unwound. But continuing OPEC+ constraint and compliance meant the market moved into deficit, and you can see stocks started to normalize. By the end of the year, around half of the excess stocks accumulated during the first part of the year had been unwound, and prices recovered to around $50 per barrel. So what lessons can we draw from this real-world stress test of global oil markets? For me, the main lesson was OPEC+ was both able and willing to step in and stabilize oil markets. But whether it means it would always be able to do so depends on the type of shock affecting oil markets. The nature of OPEC's power to shift supply from one period to another means it has the ability to offset temporary, short-lived shocks. Indeed, in response to an economic exam question of what type of demand shock is OPEC best able to stabilize, a global pandemic followed by a successful vaccine would be close to the perfect answer: relatively short-lived, temporary shocks. In contrast, the ability and incentive for OPEC to offset a sustained and growing fall in oil demand as the world transitions to net zero is less clear. In this case, there may be greater incentive for individual OPEC members to worry more about protecting and growing their market share and less about stabilizing markets. Turning now to natural gas, I want to focus here on the European gas market, because it's the largest market in which there is active gas-on-gas competition, and because of the key role it plays as a balancing market for LNG cargoes. So what can we learn from its behavior in response to the pandemic shock, with European gas imports falling by over 8.5% last year? The gas-on-gas competition in Europe takes the form of pipeline imports, predominantly from Russia, competing against LNG imports, largely from the US, as a marginal source of LNG. As LNG imports have increased in recent years, it's raised the question of the extent to which Russia and other pipeline exporters will compete against LNG to maintain their market share, or instead forego some of that share to avoid driving prices too low. This issue could become more acute in an energy transition in which Europe moves away from natural gas and competition between different gas supplies intensifies. Although there is a lot of complicating details, it appears that Russian exporters were prepared to forgo some of their market share last year. Pipeline imports from Russia as a share of European gas demand fell from 35% in 2019 to 31% in 2020, with much of that reduction happening in the first half of last year. You can see that big purple wedge there. Some of that reduction initially reflected the record storage levels which had been built up towards the end of 2019, but Russian volumes remained low through the second quarter when the impact of the pandemic on European gas demand was at its peak. In contrast, LNG imports, shown here in light blue, were up year on year in the first half of 2020, and their share of European demand for the year as a whole was broadly unchanged at 21%. However, as to whether this provides a guide to the future behavior of Russian pipeline exports is less clear. The argument here is similar to the one we just made in the context of OPEC. In response to a fall in demand that is expected to be relatively short-lived, it may be entirely rational for pipeline exporters to use their flexibility to reduce supplies temporarily to help stabilize the market and support prices. But the possible response to sustained and growing contraction in gas imports as Europe transitions away from fossil fuels could be very different, with a stronger incentive for Russian pipeline exporters to compete to be the last producer standing. One of the factors affecting the response of pipeline exporters last year was their perception of how low European prices would need to fall to shut in LNG exports. Which takes us to the second aspect I mentioned earlier, Europe as the balancing market for LNG flows. Until last year, this question of the shut-in price for LNG exports was largely hypothetical. Shut-ins had never really occurred at scale. That all changed last year. This chart here shows a highly simplified view of US LNG exporters' short-run operating costs, and that includes the transportation costs. As European LNG forward prices fell below these operating costs, this triggered a significant shut-in of US LNG exports. In simple terms, LNG exporters made a loss on each cargo they supplied, so they stopped supplying them. Average utilization rates of US LNG facilities began to fall in April last year, reaching a low of 30 to 35% at the height of the summer. US LNG exports still increased by around 30% in 2020, helped by 3 new LNG trains coming on stream and several others ramping up. But had it not been for the cancelling of the cargoes, the growth in US exports would have been closer to 80%. So looking ahead, the European market is likely to remain a key barometer for global gas market trends. Turning now to the third and final question. With the build-up to the Glasgow COP gathering pace, I want to spend a few minutes putting to last year's developments into the broader context of progress made since the Paris COP in 2015. The goals agreed at Paris are widely seen as a watershed in terms of achieving global alignment on ambitions for limiting temperature rises, and all countries agreeing to make their contribution to achieving those aims. So almost 6 years on from Paris, how is the world doing? One of the biggest changes since 2015 is the marked increase in focus and ambition on getting to net zero. At the time of the Paris Convention, no major country had made a formal commitment to achieve net zero. That accolade went to Sweden, who in June 2017 pledged to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. Fast forward to today, And 10 countries, together with the European Union, have passed net zero targets into law, and a further 34 countries have either proposed legislation or outlined formal policy intentions with the same intent. The IEA recently estimated that together these commitments and intentions account for around 70% of global carbon emissions. Although still early days, there are encouraging signs that the collective shock and huge cost of COVID may have led to renewed determination to prevent an even more damaging global trauma in the form of climate change. That rising level of ambition is also evident at the corporate level. On last count, the number of companies with stated aims or ambitions to get to net zero had increased more than sixfold since 2019 to more than 3,000 companies. That rise in corporate ambitions has coincided with growing societal expectations for companies to both increase further their transparency about climate-related risks and demonstrate that their strategies and actions are consistent with Paris goals. One indication of those changing societal expectations is a rise in ESG-related investments. Inflows into ESG-related funds have increased from less than $30 billion in 2015 to over $330 billion by 2020. So that's an 11-fold increase in just 5 years. So it seems the world of investing has changed for good. And that's in both senses of the word. Although these developments are hugely encouraging, they come with two major caveats. First, countries' pledges still don't go far enough. Despite the substantial increase in net zero aims and intentions at the national and regional level, the UN NDC synthesis report published last December concluded, and I quote, that the current level of climate ambitions are not on track to meet our Paris Agreement goals. Second, there is a mismatch between those ambitions and the outcome that the world needs and wants to see. The Paris Agreement was met with huge hope and optimism, but that hasn't yet been reflected in marked improved in the actual emissions data. This chart is based on the IEA's World Energy Outlook, or the WEO, published in November 2015, which is just prior to the Paris COP. The 2015 WEO contains 3 scenarios for carbon emissions based on different assumptions around future setting of global energy policies. First, you have the continuation of current policies, shown in red, the climate policy scenario. The implementation of declared policy intentions, in green, the new policy scenario. And a set of policies consistent with limiting global temperature increases to 2 degrees C, in purple, the 450 scenario. Until last year, carbon emissions had continued their unrelenting rise, broadly in line with the policy intentions that had been declared ahead of the Paris meeting. Importantly, there was no sign of the decisive shift envisaged by the less than 2 degrees C 450 scenario. Let's move this down. Keep blocking the chart, sorry about this. So you can see here that there was that last year, this did actually put emissions closer to the 2 degrees scenario. But as I've discussed earlier, there is a good chance that much of that dip proves temporary. So hopes and ambitions do need to be translated into tangible and concrete differences. We're not seeing that at the moment. Although much of the attention of the Paris Agreement is on the response to climate change, the agreement states that this response should be in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. The UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, or SDGs, which were adopted around the same time as the Paris COP, provide a natural benchmark for monitoring progress on this aspect of the Paris Agreement. There are several strong interconnections between these goals and the energy system, including on conservation and biodiversity, both on land, which is SDG 15, and in our oceans, SDG 14. But perhaps the closest to home is SDG 7, which is ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. The good news is that there has been significant improvements in energy access over the past 6 years. The number of people without access to electricity has fallen from close to 1 billion in 2015 to a little over 750 million by 2015. So that's around 10% of the world's population, down from 15 in 2015. 2015. So that's encouraging progress. However, just with emissions, the progress comes with some caveats. The improvements have been uneven, with 3/4 of the global population without access to electricity situated in one place, sub-Saharan Africa. Moreover, the impact of COVID has reversed some of that progress. The World Bank estimate that the pandemic has made basic electricity services unaffordable for 30 million more people, the first time the number of people without access to electricity has increased for 6 years. And access to clean cooking facilities, the other focus of SDG 7, lags far behind, with around 2.6 billion people estimated not to have access. The other caveat is that the concept of energy access is itself somewhat nebulous. The US defines access to electricity in terms of a minimum energy level of residential consumption. But the level of energy needed to support strong, sustainable growth is likely to far exceed that. Energy is vital for productive uses, as well as household consumption. For example, the Energy for Growth Hub proposes a modern energy minimum of 1,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, which they argue is consistent with countries reaching a lower middle income status. This is around 4 times greater than the UN definition. Importantly, the Energy for Growth Hub estimates that more than 3.5 billion people, close to half the world's population, are living below this modern energy minimum. Half the world population. So still lots more to do in terms of energy access. Arguably, the single most important element of the energy system needed to address both aspects of the Paris Climate Agreement is the response to the threat of climate change and supporting sustainable growth is the need for a rapid growth in renewable energy. I'm pleased to say that, as I mentioned earlier, the progress on renewable energy over the past 5 or 6 years has been a perfect example of the tangible and concrete progress that I said was necessary. If we start with what happened last year, focusing on wind and solar energy, which is where most of the action is. Despite the huge disruptions associated with the global pandemic and the collapse in GDP, wind and solar capacity increased by a colossal 238 gigawatts in 2020, 50% larger than any time in history. You can see here that the main driver of this was China, which accounted for roughly half of the global increase in wind and solar capacity. The expansion in Chinese wind capacity, 72 gigawatts, is particularly striking. And it's likely that, although it's likely that some of this reported increase reflects various changes to Chinese subsidies and accounting practices. But even controlling for that, it does seem clear that 2020 was a record year for the build-out of wind and solar capacity. Viewed over a slightly longer period, wind and solar capacity more than doubled between 2015 and 2020, increasing by around 800 gigawatts, which equates to an average annual increase of 18%. To put that 18% in context, in BP's rapid and net zero scenario, wind and solar capacity increases at an average annual rate of around 14% and 18% respectively over the next 10 years. So the current pace of growth is broadly on track with those scenarios. The challenge, of course, is to maintain the recent pace of growth as the overall size of renewable energy expands. In that context, what has underpinned the strong growth over the past 5 years? Along with many other forecasters, we materially underestimated the growth of wind and solar power over the past 5 years. These charts compare the profile for installed capacity for wind and solar in BP's 26 energy outlook, comparing it with the actual outturns. A key factor behind this underestimation is that the cost of renewable energy have fallen by far more than we projected in 2016. The cost of onshore wind and solar power have fallen by around 40% and 55% respectively. That's far more than the 15% and 20% assumed in the 2016 outlook. Although it's a gross simplification, cost reductions for renewables are often summarized in terms of a learning by doing framework. As ever increasing amount of renewable capacity are produced and installed, the supply chain learns how to become more and more efficient, driving costs progressively lower. Viewed in this way, renewable costs can fall by more than expected, either because of the build out of renewable is greater than we thought, hence allowing for more learning, or because costs fall by more for a given level of build out, faster learning. As shown in these waterfall charts, the biggest factor accounting for the larger than expected falls in renewable costs seems to have been faster learning. See that yellow wedge there, which explains around 3/4 of the error for wind costs and around 2/3 for solar costs. Interestingly, the majority of the more learning contribution for both wind and solar over the past 5 years stems from China, as renewables have gained share from coal more quickly than expected. This transition has gone hand in hand with a massive scaling up of Chinese renewable manufacturing capacity, which has helped reduce the cost of wind and solar power around the world. So it's an upbeat message on renewables. But it's important to remember that this pace of progress on renewable energy needs to be matched by the many other dimensions of the energy transition. Energy efficiency, the growth of new energy carriers, such as hydrogen, to help decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors, and the build-out of carbon capture use and storage, and other examples. Continued rapid growth in renewable energy is necessary to get to net zero, but it's not sufficient. '70th birthdays are important milestones, providing an opportunity to reflect on the events that have shaped your lives. There have certainly been many changes in the global energy market since the Stats Review was first conceived in 1952. But even at 70, you can still be surprised. And for the Stats Review, like so many of us, 2020 will go down as one of the most surprising and most dramatic years in its life, with the largest declines in energy demand and carbon emissions seen in modern peacetime. But the importance of the past 70 years pales into insignificance as we consider the challenges facing the energy system over the next 10, 20, or 30 years as the world strives to get to net zero. Will 2020 be seen as a turning point, where the shock of COVID finally caused the world to take decisive action to mitigate the threat of climate change? Will the good intentions and increased ambitions of the past few years be translated into a sharp and sustained fall in emissions? Will renewable energy be able to maintain the rapid rates of growth seen over the past 5 years? And how important will the private sector, in the form of green and greening companies, be in the eventual success or otherwise of the energy transition? If 70th birthdays are important, 100-year anniversaries are really special. What events will the 100-year-old Stats Review be able to report as it analyses energy developments in 2050? That concludes my presentation today, and I'll now be happy to discuss this or any other questions that you may have. Thank you. So let's have a look now, and I will grab some questions and bring those up. So we have 2 questions here. The first question is, what is the role of CO2 in enhanced oil recovery going forward? So I think that is an important role. It's not an area that I'm an expert in. I think, excuse me, but obviously it does reduce the cost of carbon capture and storage as well. So for a while, of course, it will potentially be an option for some of the early CCUS projects. But of course, it does get more oil out, and of course, as production falls in scenarios such as rapid and net zero, then of course there'll be less need for oil. So it's not going to be something that's going to be sustained, I think. So, but I think over the next 15 to 20 years, this could be an important form of CCUS. I hope that's helpful. See, we're starting to get a few more questions here now. Let's have a look at this. Thanks for your presentation. I'm trying to interpret the statistics. I could understand attributing the demand changes to the pandemic and social lockdown. However, how much of the generation supply mix changes and subsequent generation related emissions can be attributed to the same, considering that investment and expansion of generation capacity could not have been changed within a few months? That's a good point. That's a good point. So, I mean, we've made a lot of big deal about the strong growth in renewables in capacity, but of course there's a lag between when projects are sort of kicked off and when they're completed, and of course when they come on and then the generation. So I think you do sometimes see a bit of a lag in the data between the renewable capacity, for example, and the renewable generation. So yeah, I mean, I do think part of the reason why renewables were sort of unscathed from the pandemic, as we said, is down to one aspect is down to the fact that renewables just keeps doing its thing. It just keeps on growing. It's the fossil fuels that are sort of the marginal fuels. And when overall demand falls, then it's the fossil fuels like coal and gas that tend to react the most. They're the ones that reduce their utilization to generate power, and renewables just keeps doing its thing, keeps growing. So yes, I do think there is a little bit of that you basically didn't see an obvious reaction on renewables just because of the lag time. But having said that, I mean, I do think there are some structural reasons, as I laid out, for why renewables, this isn't a temporary effect. We've seen the cost falling. We showed how much costs have come down over the last 5 years, and also we saw governments really putting in a lot of the investment. There were a lot of stimulus plans that came out to try and limit the fall in economic activity because of COVID, and a lot of these packages were quite green. I think there was the phrase used was "build back better," and I think I think so. I think that was something that does say that renewables, the improvement in the capacity is not something that's just going to be a one-off. Hopefully that answers the question. What do we have next? What is your overall assessment on China? Either still too reliant on coal or punching above its weight in renewables? Yes and yes, I think. I mean, I think they know. I think they are aware that they're too reliant on coal, and I think they've done lots of things to reduce that, and it has come down. The share of coal in their energy mix is coming down. Obviously, it takes time. I mean, the last 5-year plan, I think, had quite a lot of measures in to reduce coal use in home use and in some industries, power. So there was a lot there already done in the last 5-year plan, and we've seen the impact. And I think they're still going. But at the same time, of course, they're a huge part of the growth in renewables now. You saw that chart. You saw. Well, I'm still sharing my screen here on my. Put it up. You've seen that chart. You see how much of that is China. Always a big share, particularly in 2020. So I mean, I think they and also, as I mentioned, if we go to this one here, China are also responsible for half or more than half of the fact that we've pushed further down the learning curve, and there are more, and the costs have come down. So China have helped the world in terms of renewables by reducing the costs because of their rapid build out. So yeah, I would agree with both statements. Yeah. Let me go on. Okay, someone's just said, okay, that's. Why do you measure conventional energy source in terms of output and renewables in terms of installed capacity rather than output? Are these statistics comparable? Okay, well, we measure it in both ways. So the end focus of the presentation was capacity, but if you go back to early on in the presentation, it was generation. So this is generation. So we have generation data. That's what goes into our primary energy measure. We have a way, which is quite a unique way of converting from renewable, non-fossil sources of generation into primary energy using a sort of input equivalence method. And so yeah, so we aren't. Luckily, we're not using capacity. It was just capacity was the bigger story this year because of what I mentioned. There was a lag, and you had this huge pickup in capacity. All right. Next question. What about the heterogeneity of the grid in different parts of the world with variable mix of wind, solar, gas, hydrogen, and fossil fuels in various regions, e.g. Africa, China, EU, and the Americas? Yeah, there's a massive mix. I mean, you have in EU, you have the highest penetration of renewables in power. You have nuclear, you have natural gas, you have solar. It's very in EU is very balanced. And I think renewables becoming almost the biggest part of that, if not 2020, but soon. Other regions, China, as we said, is very reliant on coal over time. You go to South America and with some countries like Brazil, and then it's very much hydro. So yeah, there's a huge mix. I think. I think those countries that have hydro resources will use it. That's usually there in the baseline if you can. Otherwise, I mean, it's sort of a cost question based on resources you have, but you can see the direction of travel is coal is gradually being squeezed out by renewables and to a certain extent natural gas in the emerging market. So yeah. Another question here: can carbon reach carbon neutrality in 2060? That's a tricky one. That's something we'll be looking at after we've finished the Stats Review roadshow. We'll be starting to work on our next energy outlook. We look at questions like that. I think generally China has been very successful at achieving its goals, but obviously this is probably one of the hardest things that it has to do. I mean, our outlooks only go out to 2050, and we certainly don't see China reaching net zero by 2050. But obviously, it has another 10 years, and these curves do go down quite sharp. Most of the projections you see decarbonisation really picking up pace each decade. So I think there are scenarios where it's possible. I think the technologies exist. It's all about it's all about whether China and the world will collectively choose to put the policies in place to make it happen. What else have we got here? So a lot of questions which are not questions. What does the move to renewables mean for grid stability? Has the grid stability issue in Texas last year led to concerns about renewables? That's quite a controversial one to talk about Texas, and there was, I think, a bit of disagreement about whether the issues there, underlying issues there, were renewables or whether there were other things going on. I'm not going to comment on that. But in general, I think we look at things like that as the share of renewables in power mix increases. You do reach a point where you start to get increased costs from because of intermittency of renewables. So you have to maybe bring in some energy storage, so intraday storage, perhaps some batteries getting involved. There's potentially a role for hydrogen, for sort of longer term, perhaps seasonal storage, where you store hydrogen, you create hydrogen, green hydrogen, when you have excess renewables, and then you move it to storage, and then you can use the hydrogen later. There's it does, of course, increase the costs. I mean, I think each year we've been surprised every time we do the modeling by how much more renewables can achieve and how much more it can penetrate without really hitting this point. In the past, I think people thought 30 or 40% was an issue, but I think now people are thinking going much further. 50 or 60, 70. I mean, one of the things you have to look out for is periods where you end up with like negative pricing for renewables. It's where I sometimes occasionally you have it already in Europe. In Germany, for example, if it's a very sunny day or windy day, you can end up with excess renewable electricity, which then they try and export. You get negative prices, and they export it to other countries in Europe, and it means big reductions in the use of gas in other countries as they try and take this free or negative priced electricity. So occasionally we're seeing the early stages of that in places like Europe, where it has a high penetration. But broadly speaking, we don't see the costs rising to the point where it's sort of there's a natural limit, at least in the projections that we've done. Okay. Having said that, I mean, a lot of people, there's a lot of people that say to us, "Why don't you go to 100% renewables? Isn't everything in energy going to be renewables?" Well, I think a lot of studies have shown that there is only so much you can do with electricity. I think the IEA share this view. I think they said in most scenarios you can get maybe perhaps to 2/3 of final energy demand being electrified. But you have some sectors, hard to abate sectors, where we will need other solutions. So we mentioned in the speech, I mentioned hydrogen, for example. So you have some high temperature processes which are very difficult to electrify. For example, production of steel. You have hydrogen use in refining, where it's used as a feedstock. And there's also potentially some, the heavy duty transport, so heavy duty trucking, aviation. Potentially you need other solutions. So it's not all about renewables and electricity. So yeah, good. Have you looked at whether carbon pricing regimes are expanding and at what level? Yes, we have looked at that. I mean, we've looked at. I mean, the EU ETS system is quite good example of carbon pricing helping. We've seen a noticeable shift in the coal being pushed out of power and in favour of natural gas and renewables. I think yes, the carbon pricing is really having an impact in those countries that have it. The UK has a carbon price floor and effectively squeezed all of coal out of power, and these are sort of quite easy ways to reduce emissions in power and relatively low cost, where you only need a carbon price around $40 or $50 a ton. So yeah, we looked at that. We assume maybe not. I mean, the carbon prices comes in lots of different forms. In our long-term outlooks, we do assume continual rise in carbon prices, maybe to around $100 per ton by 2030, rising to perhaps $200 by 2050 in developed economies. So, which is, but there is a big question mark at the moment about how that will be achieved in practice, because some of the issues you have, like for example, I mentioned steel. If the Europe decides to say, right, we need to use hydrogen to make steel, that increases the cost of steel. If other countries, other regions say, no, we don't want to do that, and we want to keep our steel low cost, there'll be a competition issue. And so there's a big unknown at the moment around carbon border adjustments and the carbon border taxes. And I think this is something the world needs to get to grips with, and perhaps something they'll be discussing at the COP26, I would hope, because I think that's really important for us, for the world together, being able to sort of decarbonize these difficult sectors. Hey, we got one. We got a couple of sort of light-hearted ones at the end. If I can overrun, it's I think it's only going to an hour. Do we have I don't know. Do we have another half an hour? Could someone tell me how long we've got?
Yep. You certainly do, Richard. Go ahead.
Wow. Okay. Well, keep those questions coming. Otherwise, I'll just keep rambling on. Hope it's useful. A silly question. What is the motivation behind publishing BP Statistical Review each year? It should cost a lot of money. Well, I'm not getting paid hugely for it. I just do it in part of my job. I mean, there's a few reasons for it. I mean, I think there are selfish reasons as well. I mean, we learn a lot every time we do the stats review. We learn a lot about energy markets. We learn a lot about how the energy market fits together around the data. We we use a stats review ourselves. We use it as a base. We use it in our modeling. We've got a great source of data that we can do econometrics on and model for future. It's a base of our energy outlooks, and the energy outlooks are, I would hope, a base behind our beliefs and strategy. So yeah, it's useful in that sense, but also it allows BP to come out in a sort of objective fashion and talk about energy demand. We haven't got an agenda. I'm not here to talk about BP's strategy or policy. I'm just out here talking about energy, and it just allows us to sort of just engage with we can engage with anyone who's interested in energy, governments and institutions, companies. So yeah, so that's why we do it. Mark, hi Mark, good to see you. Mark, who used to, of course, be a manager of the Statistical Review. I took over from him, so thank you for joining, listening in. It's really good to hear from you. What do you see as the biggest gap challenge in gathering relevant data about energy system? Wow, yeah, that's a good one. There are so many things we'd like to do. I mean, I think there's a lot of interest. We've had lots of questions, for example, saying, please, Statistical Review, put data together on hydrogen. Please, Statistical Review, put data together on CCUS. So all the new energies, biogas, all the new things. And so we're looking at all those, but it's really hard when you start with a new fuel or a new energy source. I mean, the interesting thing with hydrogen is it's not new. It's new in the context of, I guess, energy. It's always been around as a feedstock, but it's actually really hard to get good data on it. So that's one thing. CCUS, obviously, if we did data on that, it'd be more about projects because there isn't much in terms of actual running CCUS at the moment. It's not really at a global scale yet. What else? The other admission I would make, and this we've got a big wish list of things. We only have this small capacity to add new things. We try and do one or two things each year. One of the biggest gaps I think we have is renewable heat, or which is mainly biomass consumption outside of power and biofuels. So it's in other words, biomass consumed directly in industry, consumed directly in buildings, and that's modern biomass in buildings. We tend to try and do traded energy only, and not do traditional biomass, where it's just people collecting trees or branches or whatever. So yeah, that's an area, that's a gap we have, and something we would hope to look to fill. But it's, again, the data has to be there. It has to be hard. I think the IEA does do it, but something that we're working on as well, I think. And and there's a lot of data on emissions that we haven't got yet. So we produce estimates of carbon dioxide from energy use, but we don't include carbon dioxide emissions from process emissions, for example. So, for example, CO2 produced from cement production. And I think when you're looking at ahead, and you're looking to 2050, people don't, the world doesn't care about whether it's energy use or process emissions. They care about carbon emissions. So you sort of have to include those. So that's something else I would say that we need to think about. And of course, there's all sorts of other emissions, non-CO2 emissions that are important for global warming. There's methane and other gases. So yes, is that the sort of question? Hopefully, Mark, that's sort of what you're asking about. Let me know if you had any other questions after that, because I'm not sure I'm seeing any more. I mean, perhaps David, you have a question you may want to ask.
I'm good, Richard. I am kind of curious as to what will the world be like in 100 years when you've put this out, but so much unknown, and of course, energy transition affecting so much of what is happening within our industry right now, and will be for many more years. But no, I don't. Would you like to wrap up?
Well, we got 3 more popped in, and let's have a look.
Okay, have a go.
Yeah, I think let's have a look here. I mean, I won't be able to answer I'll be able to answer this very quickly because I haven't read. The question is, have you read Bill Gates' new book on climate change? What is your opinion? Unfortunately, I haven't read the book, I'm afraid. I'd like to, just haven't got around to it yet. So what else have we got here? Would you agree that in the countries with low energy access, energy supply could be greatly enhanced without too much of a global CO2 impact? Yes, I would agree with that. So I think we have to be careful when people say, "Oh, what about?" Sometimes I think the oil industry perhaps has been a bit too defensive about saying. You talked about like the dual challenge, whereby we've got, we should be allowed to continue to rise our production because there's so much of the world that needs energy. Yes, but energy access is not about providing huge amounts of extra oil and gas for many people. Some people there just want access to a small amount of electricity, and that may be sufficient, and that would have a huge impact on their quality of life without actually affecting the world too much. But as I mentioned in the talk, to get to the next level, if we want. I mean, there's a basic level of consumption to make sure that you're sort of healthy and well. But is it? Do you want to stop there for say Africa? I mean, ideally, we would all aspire to have to bring people more into the sort of middle income bracket at least. So that we that's something we mentioned in the speech. The fact that there's this energy for growth hub that have proposed perhaps a sort of more sensible level of target for energy access. So not just being able to have a couple of light bulbs in your house, but also that the country itself has a higher level of energy access so they can actually grow their economy and start producing things and get to sort of middle income status. So this level, I think it was 1,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. And that was 4 times the UN definition. So I think that that's actually a very, very useful way of thinking about it. So yeah, so it's sort of a so that would have some impact on global energy emissions. But if you go out 30 years, perhaps most of that electricity will come from renewables anyway. So yeah, so I'm rambling a bit now. If there's any more questions, if there's no more questions, I guess we're done. I mean, I've really enjoyed doing this. I really hope you have. I enjoyed the talk. Thank you for joining me, and maybe I'll hand it back to David to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, BP, actually, for the statistical review. We have a long-standing relationship with BP, and we absolutely love having you on our platform to present these results annually to us. I wish to thank you again, Richard, and I wish everybody a wonderful weekend coming up. Thank you for listening. This will be available on Rewind, open access later on today for those to listen to. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.